Okay, guys, so here we go with video 2B for chapter 29. Remember, we're going to split section 2 into 2 videos because of the length of it. So this will be the second video for section 2. All right, and we're going to start off talking about the Holocaust. Now, we discussed in chapter 28 how Hitler considered Jews to be an inferior race. Right? He didn't look at them as just being a separate religion or faith. He considered them to actually be a race themselves. And once he came to power, the Nazis passed laws, remember those Nuremberg laws that took legal rights away from them. In 1939, the Nazis began forcing Jews in Poland and other occupied territories to move into ghettos. Now, ghettos in European history were sections of cities that Jews were forced to live in, where they were segregated from the rest of society. In rounding up the Jews into the ghettos, Nazis forced the Jews to leave their homes, and most of their possessions were taken by the Nazis. The ghettos of Nazi-occupied territories subjected the Jews to deplorable conditions. Many died of starvation and disease. You can see them being, all of their movements were very tightly regulated. You see Juden for the Jew, okay, as they were being shuffled back and forth, between their work and their home. They had to wear the Star of David armband to identify themselves at all time. Just if people would drop dead, they were just left there, as you see in this picture. Now, throughout the 1930s, the Nazis had established a series of concentration camps, which were detention centers for people the Nazis considered enemies of the states. These camps were used for political prisoners, Polish and Russian people from conquered territories, as well, obviously, as thousands of Jews. These camps were basically slave labor camps, similar to the Russian gulags, where prisoners were often worked to death, usually put into service of the war effort. In 1941, though, Hitler and the Nazi leadership decided to take the camps to a more extreme measure when they implemented what became known as the final solution to the Jewish problem, namely genocide, meaning extermination of all Jews in Europe. Not content to just use the concentration camps, Nazi leadership redesigned several of them as death camps. Here they implemented the most efficient ways to kill people in mass numbers. When the Jews would arrive at the camps, they would be transported in basically cattle cars on train. They were separated according to age and gender. The young, elderly, and sick were killed immediately, usually by being herded into shower rooms where they were killed with poison gas. Others were worked to death, or they starved to death, or they were just murdered by other means by the guards. All total, some 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust. While they were the primary ones, Jews were not the only ones targeted, though. Any group deemed undesirable was sentenced to death as well. Now, these included non-Aryan groups like Slavs and Gypsies, as well as homosexuals and disabled people. Hitler wanted to purify Germany, so anyone who didn't meet his extreme standards was sent to the camps. Now, while the Nazis committed horrific atrocities, they weren't the only ones doing horrible things in the war. Japanese conquest and occupation was also startlingly brutal. We discussed this a little back in chapter 27 when we learned about the Japanese conquest of China and the rape of Nanking, where the Japanese military committed horrific atrocities to both Chinese military and civilians in the city of Nanking. And similar to what I said there, the visual photographs of that are so graphic and disturbing, I really didn't think it was appropriate to put it on there. But you guys can do your own research on it just to show how horrific everything was. Nanking was unfortunately not an isolated case, as all conquered people were treated brutally. Many people in places like Vietnam and the Philippines viewed the Japanese first as liberators from Western imperialism. This joy soon turned to resentment and hatred as they experienced what living under Japanese life was like. They also could be very cruel to prisoners of war. Here you see British and American soldiers being marched through the jungle. You see them as they were being marched, they would keep their hands tied behind their back and have to carry burdens as well. Now, a big reason why the Japanese treated POWs like that was that they had little sympathy for people who surrendered. The Japanese military was founded on the old warrior mentality of the samurai, and for the samurai, surrender was a shameful act. If you were defeated, you were expected to take your own life to restore your honor. POWs were often mistreated and tortured because they weren't given any type of respect or sympathy. Another reason for this was the leadership of General Tojo Hideki. Now, Tojo was the leader of the extreme militarists who ruled Japan, and much like Hitler and Mussolini, he glorified militarism and imperialism and how it would make Japan great. Now, in the process of all this conquest, the Japanese had built a very large empire in Asia and the Pacific. Right? So the red line outlines the extent of the area. Not only did you have pretty much the entire Pacific seaboard of China, you had all of Southeast Asia, what today would be Thailand and Vietnam, even though back then it was called French Indochina. You had the Philippines, that was controlled by the Americans. You had the Korean Peninsula, all of the East Indies, New Guinea, and then all of these islands as well. These islands are going to be important. We'll talk about the fighting for them in a later section. So the Japanese were very, very dominant in the Pacific by 1942. Likewise, it looked like Nazi Germany might not be stopped in Europe. This unstoppable Axis advance would finally change when the U.S. enters the war. And then the war started, the U.S. in 1939, the U.S. had maintained its official neutrality. It was still in the midst of the Great Depression and didn't want to get involved in a foreign war. But as the war went on, American involvement increased, most notably with the Lend-Lease Act. This law allowed the U.S. to lend war materials to any country whose defense the president deemed vital to the defense of the United States. Now, the wording of this law pretty much guaranteed that the U.S. was going to be helping the Allies. It wouldn't directly participate, but it would become what became known as the Arsenal for Democracy, meaning the U.S. would supply arms to those fighting for democracy and freedom. You see the eagle flying supplies and weapons and things like that, and there's a Statue of Liberty shining in the background. Now, while it was actively supporting the Allies, especially Great Britain, the U.S. decided to cut off all trade with Japan after Japan started its conquest of the Pacific. Tojo and the military leadership of Japan thought that the U.S. would harm Japanese interests in the Pacific, and they decided to attack the U.S. before it could fully get involved in the war. This brings us to Pearl Harbor. Now, Tojo ordered a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet stationed at the naval base of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And on December 7th, 1941, described by President Franklin D. Roosevelt as a day which will live in infamy, Japanese fighter planes and bombers attacked Pearl Harbor, causing significant damage to the fleet and killing over 2,000 people. The very next day, the U.S. declared war on Japan, and then 3 days after that, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. America was now officially in the war, and that was going to have some major impacts. We'll get into that with the next section when we talk about how the Allies begin to turn the tide starting in 1942.